The morning air hung thick with moisture as Harold Jennings forked fresh-cut hay into the loft of his dairy barn in southern Wisconsin. It was late June of 1943, and the Timothy grass stood tall and green in his fields, heavy with the recent rains that had blessed the county for 3 straight weeks. His neighbor, old Tom Whitaker, leaned against the barn door, watching with narrowed eyes. "That hay ain't ready, Harold," Tom said, not for the first time that week. "You can feel the wet in it. Another day of sun, maybe 2. Harold wiped sweat from his forehead and shook his head. War Production Board wants every farmer producing maximum output. Can't afford to wait. Weather report says more rain coming tomorrow. This hay goes up today or it sits in the field rotting." Tom pushed off from the doorframe and walked closer, pulling a handful of the cut grass from the wagon. He twisted it in his weathered hands, then held it up to his nose. The stems bent without breaking, and when he squeezed them, tiny droplets of moisture appeared on his calloused palm. "This Timothy's still got sap running. You stack this in your loft, you're asking for trouble." "Trouble?" Harold laughed, though there was an edge to it. "Trouble is having nothing to feed 28 dairy cows come January because I left good hay to rot in wet fields. My father taught me that empty bellies in winter are worse than any other problem a farmer faces." "Your father also taught you to check your hay before storing it," Tom shot back. "He taught you to twist it and listen for the crackle." "This hay doesn't crackle, Harold. It bends like fresh-cut grass because that's what it still is." Harold's jaw tightened. He'd been farming this land for 15 years, had taken over from his father who'd worked it for 30 years before that. The Jennings family had been putting up hay on this property since 1902, and they'd never lost a barn to fire. He wasn't about to start second-guessing himself now, especially not with production quotas breathing down his neck and rain clouds building on the western horizon. "I appreciate your concern, Tom, I really do, but I've got work to do." What Harold didn't know, what many farmers in his generation were only beginning to understand, was that his father's generation had learned their farming during a fundamentally different era. The old wisdom about getting hay under cover at any cost had been formed in decades when barns were smaller, lofts were better ventilated, and farmers cut their hay with scythes and hand tools. Those methods allowed the grass to cure properly in smaller, manageable windrows spread across the field. A man with a scythe might cut an acre in a full day's work. The hay would lie in the sun for days, turned by hand with wooden rakes before being loaded onto wagons with pitchforks. But in 1943, Harold owned a tractor-pulled mower that could cut 5 acres in an afternoon. His hay loader could process an entire field in a fraction of the time it took his father's generation. And his barn, expanded twice to accommodate a growing dairy herd demanded by wartime milk production needs, could hold 3 times as much hay as his grandfather's original structure. The scale had changed, the speed had changed, but many farmers still clung to the old rules as if nothing had shifted beneath their feet. Tom Whitaker knew this because he'd already paid the price for ignoring that shift. 3 years earlier, in the summer of 1940, he'd done exactly what Harold was doing now. He'd rushed his first cutting into the barn ahead of predicted rain, stacking nearly 8 tons of damp hay in his loft. For 6 days, everything seemed fine. His cows ate well from the previous year's supply. The new hay smelled sweet up in the loft, and Tom congratulated himself on beating the weather and keeping his feed dry. On the 7th night, his 12-year-old son had woken him at 2 in the morning, shouting that smoke was pouring from the barn loft. By the time Tom reached the barn in his nightshirt and boots, the entire hay storage area was engulfed in flames. The heat was so intense he couldn't get within 20 feet of the structure. He'd lost the barn, all his stored feed, his hay wagon, and nearly lost 3 horses that were stabled on the ground floor. His son had managed to get the horses out, but the boy's hands were blistered from the hot door latches, and the memory of that night still gave Tom nightmares. The fire marshal's report had been clear and damning: spontaneous combustion caused by excess moisture in improperly cured hay. Tom had spent the next 3 years rebuilding his operation, and he'd be damned if he was going to stand by and watch his neighbor make the same mistake. "You know what happens when you stack wet hay," Tom said quietly, following Harold up the ladder into the loft. "The center of these piles will hit 140, 150 degrees, maybe higher. The bacteria feeding on that moisture will turn this loft into a furnace. I've seen it, Harold. I've lived it. Harold paused at the top of the ladder, his pitchfork mid-air. Around him, the loft was already half full of hay from the past 2 days of cutting. The sweet smell of curing grass filled the space, and in the dim light filtering through the loft door, everything looked exactly as it should. That's old wives' tales, Tom. Hay doesn't just catch fire by itself. You probably had some electrical problem in your barn, maybe a rat chewed through some wiring. Tom's face went red. There was no electrical in my hayloft. The fire marshal confirmed it was spontaneous combustion. The hay at the center of my biggest pile was charred black, while the hay on the outside was barely scorched. That's not how electrical fires burn, Harold. That's heat building from the inside out. But Harold had already turned away, jabbing his pitchfork into the fresh hay on the wagon below and hauling up another load. Tom stood there for a long moment, watching his neighbor work with the stubborn determination of a man who'd made up his mind and wouldn't be swayed. The science behind spontaneous hay combustion wasn't particularly complicated, though many farmers in the 1940s didn't understand the chemistry involved. When hay is baled or stacked with more than 20% moisture content, the plant material continues to respire, continuing the biological processes that sustained it when it was growing in the field. This respiration breaks down starches and sugars, and that breakdown generates heat as a byproduct. In small amounts of hay or in well-ventilated conditions where air can circulate freely, this heat dissipates harmlessly into the atmosphere. A farmer might notice the hay feels slightly warm to the touch, but nothing dangerous occurs. However, in large, tightly packed masses of hay, like those in the lofts of big dairy barns where tons of feed are compressed together, the heat becomes trapped with nowhere to go. As the temperature in the hay pile climbs past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, bacteria begin to multiply at an explosive rate. These microorganisms thrive in the warm, moist environment, feeding on the plant matter and generating even more heat through their metabolic processes. The pile becomes a living thing, consuming itself from the inside out. By the time the temperature reaches 130 degrees, the bacteria die off from the heat they themselves created. But by then it's too late. Chemical oxidation takes over, and the temperature continues to rise without any living organisms involved. At 150 to 170 degrees, the hay begins to caramelize. The plant sugars literally start to cook, producing that sweet, almost pleasant smell that many farmers mistakenly associated with good hay curing properly. It was actually the smell of hay beginning to burn. Above 180 degrees, the hay begins to char, turning brown and then black at its core. And somewhere between 200 and 250 degrees, sometimes lower if conditions align just right, the hay reaches its ignition point and bursts into flame. The entire process could take as little as 4 to 6 days with very wet hay and hot weather. Sometimes it took 2 or 3 weeks with moderately damp hay in cooler conditions. This unpredictability made spontaneous combustion all the more dangerous, because farmers who had stacked questionable hay and seen no immediate problems often convinced themselves they'd gotten away with it, right up until the moment flames erupted through their barn roof. Harold finished loading the last of his first cutting over the next 2 days, working from dawn until well after dark to get everything under cover. By the time he forked the final load into the loft, he had nearly 11 tons of hay stacked in carefully constructed piles that rose almost to the loft's peaked ceiling. The rain Tom had worried about came on the third night, a genuine downpour that lasted 6 hours and dumped nearly 2 inches on the county. Harold stood at his kitchen window, watching the water sheet off his barn roof, and he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His hay was safe and dry while his neighbor's fields were getting soaked. "You did the right thing," his wife Margaret said, bringing him a cup of coffee. "Tom means well, but he worries too much. Your father never lost hay to fire, and neither will you." Harold smiled and squeezed her hand. "Jennings' family has been farming this land for 40 years. We know what we're doing." But out in the barn, in the center of the largest hay pile, something was already beginning to happen. The moisture trapped in the tightly packed timothy grass was fueling bacterial growth at an exponential rate. The temperature at the core of the pile had already climbed to 95 degrees, and it was rising steadily. Tom Whitaker came by the next morning, ostensibly to return some tools he'd borrowed, but he spent a long time in Harold's barn, and when he climbed into the loft, he didn't ask permission before plunging his hand deep into the largest hay pile. When he pulled it back, his palm was red and damp with condensation. The hay several feet down was noticeably warm, not hot yet, but definitely warmer than the ambient air temperature in the loft. "Harold!" Tom called down. "Get up here now!" Harold climbed the ladder with obvious annoyance, ready to tell his neighbor once and for all to mind his own business. But when Tom grabbed his hand and shoved it into the hay pile, Harold's expression changed. "It's warm," Harold admitted, "but hay does that when it's curing. It's a natural process." "Natural up to a point," Tom said, his voice tight with urgency. "But this pile is already warmer than it should be, and you only finished loading 2 days ago. In another 4 or 5 days, this could be hot enough to ignite. You need to tear this stack apart, spread it out, get air moving through it." Harold jerked his hand back, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. "Tom, I appreciate your concern, but I've got 28 cows to milk twice a day, fences to mend, a bull that got out yesterday and needs his pen reinforced, and I'm already behind on planning my second cutting. I don't have time to play nursemaid to hay that's curing just fine. This pile feels a little warm because it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do, settling and curing." "It's not curing," Tom said flatly. "It's cooking. And if you don't do something about it in the next 48 hours, you're going to lose this barn and everything in it." The argument that followed was one that Harold Jennings would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. Tom, normally a quiet and reserved man, raised his voice in the loft of Harold's barn, practically begging him to listen. He described in vivid detail the night his own barn burned, the moment he realized his son was right and there was smoke, the desperate scramble to save his horses, the way the heat had been so intense that it melted the hinges on the barn doors. He described standing in his yard at 3 in the morning, watching 40 years of his family's work burn to ash, while his neighbor's volunteer fire brigade could do nothing but keep the flames from spreading to his house. Harold listened, but he didn't hear. He was tired. He was stressed from the constant pressure of wartime production quotas, and he was convinced that Tom was overreacting based on his own traumatic experience. When Tom finally left, Harold went back to his regular work, pushing the nagging worry about the warm hay pile to the back of his mind. Tom didn't give up. That afternoon, he drove into town and spoke with the county agricultural extension agent, a young man named Peter Morrison, who'd taken the job just 6 months earlier. Morrison listened to Tom's concerns and agreed to visit Harold's farm the next day. But when Morrison arrived at the Jennings farm the following afternoon, Harold was in his south pasture, 4 miles away, repairing fence line where his bull had broken through. Margaret answered the door, and when Morrison explained that he'd heard there might be concerns about hay storage, she smiled politely and assured him that everything was fine. Her husband was an experienced farmer, she said, and Tom Whitaker was a kind man but tended to be overly cautious. Morrison, who had 73 farms in his district and was drowning in paperwork related to new federal agricultural programs, accepted her assurance, made a note in his file and moved on to his next appointment. Harold's 14-year-old son James had been there for the conversation between his father and Tom. James was a bright kid who devoured every farming magazine and agricultural bulletin that came through the local extension office. He'd read about spontaneous hay combustion in a recent issue of Farm Journal, and the article had included detailed temperature guidelines and warning signs. On the 4th day after the hay had been loaded, James climbed into the loft and checked the large pile himself. He had to dig down nearly 3 feet before he found what he was looking for, and what he found made his stomach drop. The hay at that depth was hot to the touch. Not warm, but genuinely hot, almost uncomfortable to hold on to. And the smell had changed. It was still sweet, but there was an edge to it now, something sharper and more acrid underneath the molasses scent. James went to find his father immediately, but Harold was dealing with a crisis of his own. 2 of his best milking cows had developed mastitis and needed immediate treatment. The veterinarian was on his way, and Harold was preoccupied with calculating how much milk production he'd lose and whether he could afford the treatment and still make his mortgage payment that month. "Pa, the hay pile is really hot," James said urgently. "I think Mr. Whitaker might be right." "Not now, James," Harold snapped more harshly than he intended. I've got sick cows, bills to pay, and a dozen other things that need my attention. The hay is fine. Tom's got you spooked with his stories, but that's all they are. Stories. James wanted to argue, but he'd learned early that when his father used that tone, the discussion was over. He went back to his regular chores, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. On the 5th day, Harold's youngest daughter, Susan, was playing in the barn while her mother worked in the garden. Susan loved the barn, loved the smell of the animals, the way the light slanted through the boards, the warm sense of being in a space that was alive with purpose. She was running through the ground floor, playing some elaborate game involving a family of barn cats when she stopped short. One section of the wooden loft floor felt different under her bare feet. She stood still, pressing her foot against the boards, trying to figure out what had changed. Then she realized the wood was warm. Not just slightly warm like sun-heated boards, but noticeably distinctly warm, as if there were a heat source directly above. "James," she called. "James, come here." Her brother was in the milk house cleaning equipment, but he heard the unusual tone in her voice and came running. When Susan showed him the warm floorboards, James's face went pale. He knew exactly what it meant. The hay pile wasn't just hot anymore. It was hot enough to be radiating heat through the thick wooden loft floor. "Go get Ma," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Tell her to find Pa right now. Tell her it's an emergency." While Susan ran for their mother, James climbed into the loft. The sweet smell he'd noticed the day before was much stronger now, and underneath it was definitely something acrid, like burning sugar. He approached the large hay pile cautiously and placed his hand against it without digging down. Even the surface was warm to the touch now. Then he made a decision that probably saved the barn from burning while people were still inside it. He grabbed a pitchfork and jabbed it deep into the pile, all the way to the handle. When he pulled it out, he could see heat waves shimmering in the air around the tines. The hay that came out with the pitchfork was dark brown, almost black, and when he touched it, he jerked his hand back immediately. It was hot enough to burn skin. James didn't wait for his father. He ran to the barn door and looked out across the farmyard. His father was in the far field with the cultivator. He could see the distant figure and the dust plume from the equipment. There was no time to run all the way out there and back. He made the hardest decision of his 14 years. He went into the house and called the volunteer fire department. "This is James Jennings out on County Road 12, he said when someone answered. "We've got a hay fire starting in our barn. It's not burning yet, but it's hot enough that it's going to go up soon. We need help." The dispatcher asked him several questions. Was there smoke? Were there flames? Were there people or animals in danger? James answered as clearly as he could, his voice shaking. No visible smoke yet, no flames, but the hay was well over 200 degrees based on how hot it felt. All the animals were out in the pasture. Nobody was in danger right that moment. But they would be if the hay ignited. By the time Harold came in from the field, alerted by Margaret, who'd driven the truck out to get him, the situation had deteriorated rapidly. Thin wisps of smoke were now rising from the loft, visible through the cracks in the boards. The sweet smell had been replaced by the unmistakable odor of burning hay, sharp, acrid, and growing stronger by the minute. Harold's first reaction wasn't fear. It was anger. Anger at himself for not listening. Anger at the situation, anger at the timing. He stood in his barnyard, looking at the smoke beginning to pour from his loft, and for a long moment he couldn't move. Every fiber of his being wanted to deny what was happening, to believe there was still some way to fix this without losing everything. "Pa," James said quietly, "the fire department is coming. I called them." Harold turned to look at his son, and something in James's expression, the fear mixed with determination, the readiness to be yelled at but the certainty that he'd done the right thing, broke through Harold's paralysis. "You did good, son," Harold said, and his voice was hoarse. "Real good. Now help me get anything valuable out of the ground floor before this gets worse." The volunteer fire department was 6 miles away in the town of Millbrook, and in 1943 that meant a response time of at least 20 minutes on rural roads. Harold, James, and Margaret worked frantically to salvage what they could from the barn. The dairy cows were already out in the pasture. They'd been turned out that morning for grazing. But there was equipment, tools, harnesses, spare parts. and countless small items accumulated over years of farming. The smoke thickened quickly. What had started as thin wisps became heavy, rolling clouds that poured from every crack and gap in the loft structure. Harold made multiple trips into the barn, carrying out armloads of tools and equipment, working in the increasingly dense smoke that stung his eyes and made him cough. Margaret saved the milking machines, expensive equipment that had taken Harold years to afford. James, against his father's orders, darted back in to grab the metal milk cans and his mother's butter churn. On what would be Harold's last trip into the barn, he was carrying out a set of harnesses when he heard it, a deep, hollow roar from somewhere above, like a giant drawing breath. He looked up through the smoke and saw an orange glow beginning to show through the loft floorboards. The hay had reached its ignition point. "Everyone out!" Harold shouted. "Out now!" They cleared the barn just as the first flames burst through the roof shingles. It happened faster than Harold would have believed possible. One moment there was just smoke and that ominous orange glow. The next moment there were flames, real visible flames, licking through the gaps in the roof. And then, with a sound like a freight train, the entire loft structure erupted into a full inferno. The heat was incredible. Even standing 50 feet away in the farmyard, Harold could feel it on his face like standing too close to a blast furnace. The flames rose 30, 40 feet above the barn roof, and the roar was so loud they couldn't hear each other speak without shouting. The volunteer firefighters arrived to find a situation that was already beyond saving. Fire Chief Robert Chen, whose family had farmed in the county since the 1890s, had seen dozens of barn fires caused by spontaneous hay combustion. He took one look at the inferno and knew there was nothing to be done but contain it and protect the surrounding buildings. "We're not going to save the barn," Chen told Harold bluntly. "Best we can do is keep it from spreading to your house and outbuildings. Get your family away from the structure. This is going to burn for hours." The firefighters set up their pumps and hoses, drawing water from Harold's stock pond. They soaked the ground between the burning barn and the house, kept the nearby machine shed wet, and made sure no flying embers landed on anything combustible. But the barn itself was a lost cause. The hay fire was burning at temperatures hot enough to crack the stone foundation and warp the metal roof supports. Harold stood in his farmyard with his wife and children, watching the barn his father had helped him build in 1928, consumed by flames. Inside were 11 tons of hay, enough feed to carry his dairy herd through most of the coming winter. Also burning were spare parts for his equipment, extra lumber he'd been saving for repairs, and countless tools and supplies. The hay wagon was in there too, parked in the ground floor bay, and Harold watched the flames take it, the wooden sides blackening and then collapsing into ash. Tom Whitaker arrived as the fire was at its peak. He didn't say anything, just stood next to Harold in silence, watching the flames. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said. After a long while, Tom put his hand on Harold's shoulder, squeezed once, and went to help the firefighters manage the hoses. The fire burned for 7 hours. The hay, once it reached full combustion, produced such intense heat that metal tools in the ground floor melted into unrecognizable lumps. The wooden loft beams, some of them 12 inches thick, were reduced to charcoal and ash. When the flames finally exhausted themselves late that night, what remained was a skeletal framework of the ground floor, smoke blackened and water damaged, and a pile of smoldering ruins where the loft had been. The next morning, in the grey light of dawn, Harold walked through what was left of his barn. The smell of wet ash and burned hay was overwhelming. He found the remains of his hay wagon, just the metal wheels and axle, everything else gone. He found puddles of melted metal that had once been tools, and he found something else that made him stop and stare. Nailed to one of the few remaining support posts was a thermometer, not a hay thermometer, just a regular household thermometer someone had hung there years ago to monitor barn temperature in winter. The glass bulb had shattered from the heat, but the metal backing was still intact. The temperature scale went up to 120 degrees. Harold stood there looking at that broken thermometer for a long time. A hay thermometer at the farm supply store cost $3. $3 would have told him his hay pile was heating dangerously. $3 would have given him warning in time to tear the pile apart and save everything. $3 that he'd been too stubborn, too proud, or too convinced of his own experience to spend. The total loss was estimated at $4,500, equivalent to nearly 2 years of income for a dairy farm of that size. But the financial damage was only part of the cost. Harold now faced a winter with no stored hay for his herd. He'd have to buy feed, paying premium prices, assuming he could even find enough available in a region where many farmers were facing similar shortages due to the war effort. Harold Jennings wasn't alone. That summer of 1943 saw barn fires caused by spontaneous hay combustion destroy an estimated 800 to 1,000 barns across the United States. The wartime push for maximum agricultural production had created a perfect storm of conditions. Farmers rushing to meet quotas, cutting hay on tight schedules without adequate curing time, stacking more hay than ever before in larger barns with less ventilation. Insurance companies reported losses exceeding $3 million. Harold's neighbors responded the way rural communities always had. 3 days after the fire, 42 men from surrounding farms showed up at dawn with lumber, tools, and a day's labor. Tom Whitaker was there first, and he worked alongside Harold until sunset, helping frame a new structure. Nobody mentioned the warnings that had been ignored. You helped your neighbors rebuild, and you trusted they'd learned their lesson the hard way. Harold learned his. He bought a moisture meter and a hay thermometer from the farm supply store, and he used them religiously for the next 27 years of his farming career. He began speaking at Grange Hall meetings about what had happened, not to shame himself, but to save others from making the same mistake. When younger farmers started their operations in the 1950s and 60s, Harold was the man they'd visit to learn about hay storage. He kept detailed records of moisture content for every cutting, and he'd loan his thermometer to anyone who needed it. When Harold finally retired in 1970 and sold his farm to a young couple from Minnesota, he gave them two things: his farm records and his hay thermometer, still in perfect working condition after nearly 3 decades of use. This cost $3 in 1943, he told them, placing the thermometer in their hands. Not buying one sooner cost me $4,500. That's the best math lesson you'll ever get in farming. The couple kept that thermometer hanging in their barn for the next 30 years, and they never stacked wet hay. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed learning about this important piece of American farming history, please subscribe to our channel for more stories about rural life and agricultural wisdom from the past. Give this video a like and share it with anyone who appreciates the challenges and lessons of traditional farming. This video is inspired by real historical facts and true farming practices from the 1930s through 1970s. It is not intended to represent or offend any specific individuals or families. Harold Jennings is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar situations during this era, learning difficult lessons about hay storage and spontaneous combustion that would shape agricultural practices for generations to come.